They mocked his $200 dead farmhouse. 9 years later, it was the envy of the county. The farmhouse had been empty for 11 years when Raymond Cutler bought it. That was the first thing people noticed. The second was the price. $200, not $2,000, not $20. $200 cash for a 2-story structure on 14 acres in Caldwell County, Kentucky. And the only reason the county tax office accepted it was because no one else had offered anything at all. It was March of 1962. Raymond was 34 years old. He'd driven down from Eddyville in his '54 Ford F-100, the bed empty, no tools, no materials, no plan beyond the folded deed in his shirt pocket. He stood in the gravel lane looking at the house for a long time before he got out of the truck. The porch had collapsed on the east side. The roof sagged at the center ridge. 2 windows on the upper floor were boarded shut with pine slabs that had since warped away from the frames, leaving gaps. The front door hung open on one hinge. Every visible surface had been weathered to the same gray-brown, the color of something left too long in the rain. The well casing in the yard had rusted through at the collar. He walked the perimeter first. 4 sides, 30 minutes. Checked the foundation stones at each corner, pressed his boot against the sill plates where they met the ground, counted the broken panes, wrote numbers on a folded envelope he kept in his back pocket. Raymond Cutler was not a carpenter. He had worked the past 9 years at the Eddyville grain elevator, loading and weighing, and before that 2 years on his father-in-law's tobacco allotment in Lyon County. He knew how to work. He did not know how to build. That distinction would matter to a lot of people in Caldwell County. It would matter loudly, and for a long time. By the end of that first day, he had walked every room in the house. The kitchen floor had soft spots in 2 corners where water had come in through a failed downspout. The main staircase had lost 3 risers. The upstairs bedroom at the back retained most of its plaster, which surprised him. The chimney brick looked sound from the outside. The cellar held 6 inches of standing water, but the stone walls were tight. He drove back to Eddyville that evening, told his wife Loretta what he'd found. She asked one question. He said he thought so. She didn't push further. She was 31 years old and had grown up watching her father fix things with what he had on hand rather than what the hardware store said he needed. She understood the distinction between a problem and a cost. Raymond returned to the farmhouse the following Saturday with a Craftsman hand level, a 50-foot tape measure, and the envelope of numbers from the week before. He spent 4 hours checking the floor joists through the cellar access. Found 6 that had gone soft near the bearing ends. Counted the rafters visible through a gap in the attic ceiling. Found 2 cracked, but not broken. Noted the chimney flashing had lifted at the front face, but the mortar between the flue tiles showed no visible cracking. He drove to Princeton that afternoon. Walked through a salvage yard on the south side of town, the one on Route 62 that had been operating since the early 1950s. The owner was a man named Olin Pruitt. Raymond spent 2 hours there, writing prices on the back of the envelope. Used floor joists, 210, 8 feet, 12 cents each. Roof shingles, cedar, bundled, 40 cents per bundle. Window glass, single pane, salvaged from a demolished schoolhouse in Fredonia, 6 cents per light. Door hardware, various, negotiable. He drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the envelope and a pad of paper. Worked numbers for an hour. Loretta made coffee and left him to it. He tallied a materials figure of $218 for what he considered Phase 1. Floor, roof, windows, water source. That was on top of the $200 purchase. $418 total. His brother-in-law, Gene Hollis, heard about it at the feed store in Kuttawa 2 weeks later. Gene told 3 people that day. By Friday, Raymond had heard from 2 of them. The consensus was consistent. Nobody said it to his face, but Dale Fitch at the grain co-op told him what had been said in general terms. People thought he'd lost his judgment, thought he'd spent 200 Dahlbosers on a teardown, thought the labor alone would break him before the structure would. Raymond thanked Dale for telling him. Drove to the salvage yard in Princeton on Saturday. The first materials arrived at the farmhouse on the first weekend of April 1962. 12 floor joists in the truck bed, a bundle of cedar shingles, 14 panes of salvaged glass wrapped in old newspaper. Raymond had borrowed a hydraulic bottle jack from his neighbor, Paul Simmons, who farmed 60 acres north of Eddyville and kept every tool he'd ever owned in a tin-roofed equipment shed. The jack was for lifting the floor framing high enough to slide out the rotted joists and replace them. Raymond had watched Paul do the same operation on a tenant house the previous fall. He had paid close attention. The first joist took 3 hours. He split one salvaged replacement, driving the first nail wrong, and had to lay in a second. By the end of that Saturday, he had replaced 2 joists. His hands were torn up from the crawl space, and his back was tight from working bent over in 18 inches of clearance. He drove home and told Loretta it was going to take longer than he'd planned. She asked how much longer. He said he wasn't sure yet. The second weekend went faster. He had the method now. By the third weekend of April, all 6 damaged joists were out, and the replacements were in. He tested the kitchen floor by jumping on the soft spots. The bounce was gone. The wood held. The roof was a different problem. The ridge sag was not a rafter issue. It was a ridge board that had split longitudinally, probably from a falling branch, possibly 15 years prior, given the state of the surrounding shingles. To fix it properly required removing a 12-foot section of roofing, sistering a new ridge board to the old one, and re-shingling the affected section. Raymond did not own a ladder tall enough. He borrowed one from Olen Pruitt at the salvage yard, who had a 22-footer that just reached the eave. He had his brother Chester come up from Fredonia the first weekend of May to work the second position on the roof. Chester was 28 and had done some roofing on his own place. They worked 2 Saturdays on the ridge. Got it done. Olen Pruitt heard from Chester about the farmhouse project that June. He stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon without calling ahead. Walked the property with Raymond for 40 minutes. Looked at the foundation corners. Looked at the repaired floor. Looked at the chimney. Asked Raymond where he'd gotten the joists. Raymond told him. Olen said they were good stock. That schoolhouse lumber from before the war ran tighter grain than what the mills were cutting now. Then Olen told him something that changed the trajectory of the next several years. He said there was a limestone spring house at the back of the lot, 40 yards behind the main structure, mostly buried in blackberry cane. Said he'd salvaged from this property years ago, when the previous owner still held it, and he remembered the spring house from that visit. Said the spring itself might still be running. Raymond found it the following Saturday. 3 hours with a machete and a pruning hook to get through the cane. The spring house was 4 feet below grade, stone-walled, roofed in original slate, and the spring was running. Not a trickle. A consistent flow, maybe 3 gallons a minute, pooling in the stone basin and overflowing through a cracked tile pipe that led downhill into the creek bed. He stood there in the cleared cane for a long time. The water came out cold. 47 degrees by his meat thermometer. Clear. He brought a jar of it home and they drank it that evening. That spring changed what the property was worth. Not on paper. Not yet. But it changed what was possible. By July of 1962, the windows were in. Raymond had glazed each one himself, watching a tutorial demonstration at the hardware store in Princeton on a Saturday afternoon in June, and then practicing on 2 broken frames from the salvage yard until he had the technique right. The front door had a new hinge and a latch. The porch on the east side was rebuilt from 3 10-foot sections of salvaged lumber, supported on new concrete piers Raymond had poured himself using a mix of 1 part cement, 2 parts sand, 3 parts gravel, and a borrowed half-bag mold. The house was not finished, not close. The interior walls needed replastering in 4 rooms. The kitchen had no sink, no running water, no appliances. The upstairs needed its floors refinished. The cellar needed draining and waterproofing. The well casing needed replacement. But the envelope was dry and the structure was sound. Raymond and Loretta moved in on August 3, 1962, 5 months after he'd bought the place. Gene Hollis heard they'd moved in and drove by that week. He slowed at the lane but didn't stop. The neighbors to the south were Calvin and Ruth Bauer. Calvin farmed 110 acres of corn and dark-fired tobacco. He was 58 years old and had lived in the county his whole life. He stopped by in September with a jar of sorghum his wife had put up and stood on the new porch for half an hour, talking with Raymond about the foundation stones and the quality of the springhouse water and what kind of cistern system Raymond planned to run from the spring to the house. Calvin Bauer was the first person in Caldwell County who spoke to Raymond Cutler without a particular kind of skepticism behind his eyes. He would not be the last. But that took time. The replastering started in October of 1962. Raymond had never plastered before. He went to the library in Princeton and checked out 2 books on interior finish work. He practiced on the cellar wall, mixing brown coat and finish coat, working the hawk and trowel until the coverage came out level. He ruined the first 2 patches in the kitchen. By the 3rd, he had the motion. 2 rooms that winter, 2 more the following spring. The upstairs floors he refinished in the summer of 1963, using a rented drum sander from the hardware store. 60 grit paper first, then 80. Then finish with a coat of Minwax dark walnut he found at the back of the hardware store shelf for 70 cents a quart. Reduced because the lid had been opened. The floors came out darker than he planned. Loretta said they were right. The cistern system from the springhouse took most of the fall of 1963 to build. Raymond trenched the line by hand, 140 feet from the springhouse, to a collection tank he'd built from salvaged concrete block in the corner of the cellar. He laid 3-inch clay tile in 6-inch sections, sloped at 1/4 inch per foot, and covered the trench with native stone he'd pulled from a collapsed section of the old fence line on the north property edge. The water reached the cellar tank in November 1963. He rigged a hand pump from there to the kitchen, 22 feet of pipe through the floor and up through the cabinet base. Loretta turned the handle the first time on a Thursday afternoon, and cold spring water came out of the spout. She filled a glass, drank it standing at the counter. Didn't say anything. That was enough. By the spring of 1964, people had started noticing something they didn't have a framework for. Raymond Cutler had been in the house 2 years. The property didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a farm that someone had been working carefully for a long time. The fencing on the east boundary had been relaid using the original limestone posts he'd reset in new soil. The lane was graveled from the road to the house. A kitchen garden ran 30 feet along the south wall, planted with beans, tomatoes, sweet corn, and 6 hills of winter squash. Calvin Bauer mentioned it to 3 other farmers at the Princeton livestock auction in April. Said the Cutler place had come around considerable. Said the springhouse water was the best in the county. Said Raymond had put the thing back together without calling in a single contractor. One of those 3 was Thomas Lindeman, who farmed the largest holding in the western part of the county, 340 acres of mixed grain and livestock. Thomas Lindeman had not previously spoken to Raymond Cutler about anything. He drove by the Cutler place that same week, slowed at the lane, kept going. Raymond was planting the kitchen garden when this happened. He watched the car slow and continue, said nothing about it. The chimney needed repointing in the summer of 1964. Raymond had noticed the mortar at the base of the stack crumbling that past winter during a hard freeze, the expansion pushing 2 joints open on the south face. He bought a bag of Type S mortar mix at the hardware store and borrowed Calvin Bauer's extension ladder, a 28-footer that reached the chimney cap. He spent a Saturday and most of a Sunday on the chimney. Raked every joint he could reach to a depth of 3/4 of an inch. Wet the brick, packed the mortar in with a pointer tool, struck it flat. Came down off the ladder on Sunday afternoon and stood back and looked at it. The south face was clean, sharp joints, mortar the right color. It looked like it had been done by someone who'd done it before. Gene Hollis drove by that August on his way to town and stopped this time. Got out and walked up the lane. Stood on the porch and looked at the house for a minute before saying anything. He said he had to admit the place had come along. Raymond thanked him. Gene said he still thought the kitchen needed work. Raymond agreed. Gene left. That was the whole of it. But it was the first time Gene Hollis had admitted anything. And Raymond noted it the way he noted most things, quietly, without making a production of it. The kitchen range came in the fall of 1964. A wood-burning Monarch, cast iron, 4 lids, a warming oven above, and a baking oven to the right. It came from an estate sale in Crittenden County, $63, and Raymond and Chester brought it down in the truck bed with a furniture dolly and 3 moving blankets. It weighed 420 pounds. Setting it in place took 4 men and an hour and a half. Loretta cooked supper on it that same night. Pork chops, sweet potatoes, and biscuits in the baking oven. The biscuits came out even and brown. The house began to feel like itself. By 1965, Raymond had added a root cellar off the main cellar, dug by hand over 6 weekends in the spring, lined with salvaged brick, shelved with locust lumber cut from a thicket on the north end of the property. A smokehouse went up that summer, built from the original foundation footings of a collapsed outbuilding he'd found buried under 20 years of vegetation on the east lot line. 12 feet by 10 feet, poured concrete floor, a steel damper door fabricated at a machine shop in Eddyville for $11. People started coming by to see things, not in groups, not formally. Calvin Bauer brought his son over in the spring of 1965 to look at the Springhouse cistern system. The son was building a place in Lyon County and wanted to understand gravity-fed water supply. Raymond walked them through the whole system: collection, tile run, cellar tank, hand pump. He told them what hadn't worked first and what he'd changed. Thomas Lindeman came by in June of 1965. This time he turned into the lane and parked at the house. He walked the property with Raymond for nearly 2 hours. Asked about the foundation repair, the floor joists, the cistern, the smokehouse construction. At the end of it, Lindeman said the place looked like it had been built yesterday. Said he meant it as a compliment to the original builder. Raymond said he'd pass that along to himself. Lindeman didn't laugh, but his expression changed. He said something about the Springhouse water, said he'd been on a dug well 40 years and the casing was going. Asked if Raymond thought the spring flow was sufficient for a larger holding. Raymond told him the flow rate, told him the temperature, told him what the tile system had cost in materials and labor. Lindeman went home and thought about that. He came back 3 weeks later. The fact that he came back was the answer to a different question entirely. By the summer of 1966, 4 years after Raymond had bought the place, The Cutler farm had developed a particular reputation in Caldwell County that had nothing to do with what people had first said about it. The house was sound. The systems worked. The land had been fenced and gardened, and the livestock, Raymond had added 6 Hereford cattle and 12 laying hens by this point, were well kept and producing. The buildings were maintained to a standard that people in the county associated with older established operations, not with a man who'd bought a ruin for $200. Gene Hollis stopped by that July. He stayed for supper. He was 37 years old and had recently started thinking about buying a neglected place on the Crittenden County line. He asked Raymond how he'd figured out what to tackle first. Raymond thought about it, said he started with what would fail everything else if he didn't fix it: structure, then water, then heat, then finish. Said he never spent money he didn't have, and never hired out work he could learn. Said the library was better than any contractor he'd seen because it showed you the reasoning, not just the method. Gene went home and bought the Crittenden County place the following March for $1,800. His place was livable and tight inside 4 years. He never acknowledged to Raymond that the supper conversation was where it had started. Raymond didn't bring it up. In the spring of 1967, the county extension office ran a feature in their quarterly bulletin about traditional building techniques and property rehabilitation. The county agent, a man named Warren Fogle, had been watching the Cutler place for 2 years. The piece ran 4 pages. It covered the floor joist replacement, the spring cistern system, the chimney repointing, and the smokehouse reconstruction. It listed the materials costs, the labor hours Raymond estimated, and the original purchase price. It did not say the house had been called worthless. It did not need to. Raymond received 14 letters in response. 3 were from county agents in other districts. 2 were from farmers with similar properties asking about mortar mix and spring flow rates. 1 was from a preservation group in Louisville requesting a site visit. He answered all of them. Thomas Lindeman heard about the Louisville visit at the Princeton livestock auction that fall. He said to no one in particular that he supposed Cutler had known what he was doing from the beginning. Calvin Bauer, who was standing next to him, said he had thought so at the time. Neither of them mentioned what had been said at the feed stores and grain co-ops in March of 1962. Neither of them needed to. By the fall of 1971, 9 years after Raymond had pulled into the lane in his Ford truck and stood looking at the collapsed porch and the open door, the Cutler place was the most visited private farm in Caldwell County. Not for tours, not commercially. But Raymond had become the person county agents sent people to when they had an old property they didn't know what to do with. He wasn't a contractor. He told everyone that. He was a man who had figured something out and was willing to explain it. He had replastered 7 rooms total, rebuilt the well casing with a submersible pump in 1968 as backup to the cistern system, added a frame addition on the north side in 1969, 16 by 20 feet, poured foundation, insulated, sided with rough sawn cedar milled from 2 black oaks that had come down in a storm. He'd hired Chester for the framing at $2 an hour. Everything else he'd done himself. The addition cost $340 in materials. The whole property, purchase, materials, every repair and addition across 9 years had cost Raymond Cutler $1,147. That number came from a ledger he'd kept from the first day. Every receipt taped in, every cost noted. He showed it to Warren Fogle at the extension office in the fall of 1971 when Fogle asked for the figure. Fogle wrote it down twice. A man from the Princeton newspaper came out that October and wrote a piece for the local section. The headline described the property as one of the finest examples of rural restoration in the western part of the state. Raymond read it once and put it in a kitchen drawer. Raymond Cutler, farmed the Caldwell County property until 1988. Sold it that year to a farm family named Woodard from Christian County, who were looking for a place with good water and sound buildings. He was 60 years old. He and Loretta moved to a smaller place in Lyon County, closer to her sister. The Woodards kept every system Raymond had installed. They kept the cistern line from the spring house. They kept the Monarch range in the kitchen. They kept the smokehouse and used it every fall for hog killing time. They replanted the kitchen garden in the same 30-foot run along the south wall. A drought came in the summer of 1993 that dropped the water table across the county by 12 feet. Half the dug wells in Caldwell County went dry that August. The Woodard place was unaffected. The springhouse flow dropped by about a third, but the cistern held, and the house had water throughout. Calvin Bauer's son came by that August, his own dug well having gone dry. He spent an afternoon at the springhouse looking at the tile run and the collection basin. He said his father had been right about this place from the beginning. The Woodards didn't fully understand what he meant, but they thanked him. The Monarch range is still in the kitchen. Same spot Raymond said it. 2 feet from the east wall, flue pipe running up through the second-floor ceiling and out the original chimney stack that Raymond had repointed in the summer of 1964. The tile in the springhouse basin has been replaced once, in 2001. But the stone walls and the slate roof are original. Raymond drove past the place once in 1994 on his way down from Eddyville. He turned into the lane without fully planning to. Sat in the truck and looked at the house for a few minutes. The porch was still standing, new boards on the east side where the Woodards had replaced some of the floor planking. But the framing Raymond had put in, still carrying it. The chimney was clean. The garden was running. He backed out of the lane and drove on. The farmhouse that cost $200 in March of 1962 was appraised at $47,000 in 1988 when the Woodards bought it. The springhouse water system, the restored structure, the rebuilt outbuildings, all of it accounted for in that number. All of it the work of one man who had not known how to build anything when he started. The ledger Raymond kept is still in the family. His daughter has it. Every receipt, every cost, every material entry from March 1962 to the sale in 1988. 47 pages. Total on the last line, 1847. That was the whole of it. $200 for the ruin, $1,647 for the work. 26 years of a family's life in a house that everyone said couldn't be saved. It was saved. Still standing, still sound, still running spring water from a stone basin 40 yards behind the main house. The same water that came out cold in November of 1963 and filled the first glass Loretta drank standing at the kitchen counter. Nothing fancy about any of it, just the work and the patience to do it right.